Good evening. Welcome to the December 17th meeting of the Everett Planning Commission, our final meeting of 2024. Ayana, would you please call the roll?
Chair Chatters.
Here.
Commissioner Yanasak.
Here.
Commissioner Ballard.
Here.
Commissioner Finch.
Here.
Commissioner Sullivan.
Here.
Commissioner Shelby.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now read the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the original inhabitants of this place, the Shtahobsh people and their successors, the Tulalip tribes. Since time immemorial, they have hunted, fished, gathered on, and taken care of these lands and waters. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. We will strive to be honest about our past mistakes and bring about a future that includes their people, stories, and voices to form a more just and equitable society. We have two sets of meeting minutes from the November 19th and the December 3rd, 2024 meetings. Commissioners, you've all had an opportunity to review those meeting minutes. Are there any corrections that anyone would like to offer? Okay, seeing none, is there any objection? I'm sorry?
Just a modest correction in the first sentence under public comments on the November 19th minutes. I think we're missing a word or two in that first sentence.
Is this a scrivener's error that you're pointing out? Okay. Okay, then I don't think we need to do an amendment for that. I think we'll just note that there is a scrivener's error in the sentence that is indicated by Commissioner Finch. That should be corrected. Okay. Any corrections, commissioners? Okay, seeing no additional corrections, is there any objection to approving the minutes from both the 3rd of December and the 19th of November? Okay, then without objection, both of those meeting minutes are approved. We now have an opportunity for commissioner reports. Commissioners, any reports this evening other than it being a very special day for one of our beloved commissioners? Okay. Yorick, I think you'd like to say a few words here.
I would absolutely. Want to extend a great big thanks to Commissioner Yanasak. 7 years, 100 meetings. Not sure if you made every single one of those, but I think a very, very great majority of them. And 114,800 people and counting better off because of your service to the city. Really appreciate in the 3 of those years, I think, that I've been working with this planning commission. You've given some really great insights. You've asked good questions. You've had a really great humor and approach to all of this, collegial with your colleagues on the planning commission as well as with staff. I think you've been a very great asset to the city, and I give you the thanks of myself and the planning staff and the rest of the city, and wish you well on your Tuesday evenings to come. Don't be too bored. These meetings continue to be on YouTube, and you're welcome to watch, you're welcome to give comments. We've got a certificate of appreciation for you that can, I believe you practice law, which means you must have a wall somewhere that has some certificates and diplomas on the wall, so this could maybe join them. And I was able to dig up, interestingly, we should probably do another group photo at some point. This is the Planning Commission on what I understand was your first meeting on December 5th, 2017. And there you are in the back, ready for a great 7 years of service. So hasn't changed a bit, maybe for the better. I don't know if you have any reflections on 7 years or if anyone else wants to say a couple words. I'll bring this up your way.
Well, I think that the commissioner who knows Commissioner Yanasak best is Commissioner Finch. And so Commissioner Finch, if you wouldn't mind.
It's tough to compare with York's comments, but Commissioner Yanasak, I so appreciate your participation and leadership on the Planning Commission. You have been a commissioner for the entire time that I have been on this commission. In fact, prior to joining the Planning Commission, I watched you from the audience, hoping to serve next to you. You've been sound counsel, rational, reasonable, inquisitive, and I think you've been an excellent commissioner. So thank you for your service.
Thank you, Commissioner Finch. I just want to say thank you too. It's been my privilege to be a part of it. I appreciate everybody's. I remember all those folks, and have appreciated the opportunity to serve. And I would just say, Everett's not a perfect city, but I think it's great. I love it, and I'm grateful that I had an opportunity to spend some time doing this and getting to know a bit about the planning department. I think there's been great leadership in the department, and so it's been great for me to get to know more about that and to stay connected to the goings on in the city, and I really appreciate all of that. So, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Commissioner Yanosek, and from all of us up here, sincerely, thank you for serving the Everett community. And if you ever get bored on a Tuesday, you know where to come for that fun. We will be here. Yorick, I think we'll turn it over to you for staff comments.
That was the main bit. It's end of year. We've had 17 meetings this year. I think in past years I've done a recap of them. Been pretty busy these past couple of weeks, so we'll do kind of a year in review, I think, in our January meeting. Also in the January meeting, commissioners will have the opportunity to choose a chair and a vice chair. So look forward to that. And other than that, we have a couple of really important agenda items and topics to discuss today. We will use every moment of Commissioner Yanosak's remainder of his term. And then, looking forward to getting pretty close to wrapping up this periodic update in the beginning of the new year. We have a dwindling number of elements that we have to do initial briefings on, and then we'll do a little work to bring it all together, and we'll cover regulations and everything. So just look forward to a good start to a new next year. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have an opportunity for public comment. To those of you joining us remotely, please mute your microphone, or if you're calling in, mute your phone by pressing *6. At each opportunity for public comment, I'll ask if anyone wants to speak. If you're participating remotely and would like to provide comment, unmute your microphone or press *6 on your phone. Please provide your name for the record, and when you're done, please mute again. If you are in attendance and would like to comment, please fill out a speaker sign-in sheet located on the table by the door. I did not receive any speaker sign-in sheets, so I assume we do not have any in-person comments.
Would caller with phone number ending in 0007 like to make a comment?
No comment at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we will move on to agenda item number 5, Everett 2044 Middle Housing Regulations.
While we're fiddling over here, I'll introduce Alex Brennan with FutureWise, who's going to give a presentation on some work that his organization has been doing along with LISC and the Housing Consortium in Casino Road. And back to the public comments you should have at your table. We did get one written public comment that you've got at your places, and you'll see that on the web as well. Alex. And that button. Yep.
Okay, now you guys, there we go. Yeah, you guys can hear me. Planning commissioners, thanks so much for this opportunity to speak with all of you tonight. As Yorick was just saying, I've been working with my colleagues at the Housing Consortium and LISC, who are over here, on collecting feedback and input from the Casino Road community on issues related to the comprehensive plan, and then trying to take that feedback that we've gotten and turn them into some recommendations to present to you all today. And I know, also have a memo from me that writes a lot of those recommendations up in more detail. So my hope today is to just kind of touch on each of them at a high level, and then have some time for discussion. I'm interested to hear from all of you and answer questions as well. a little bit more about me and my organization before we jump into the details. So FutureWise works throughout Washington State to encourage healthy, equitable, and opportunity-rich communities and to protect our most valuable farmlands, forests, and water resources through wise land use policies and practices. So we're a nonprofit that works specifically on planning, zoning, all of the things that you guys work on. And we work with cities and counties all across Washington State. So it's been really great to be able to get more engaged with the City of Everett over the last couple of years. I wanted to start out just sort of reflecting a little bit on how I first got connected to the Casino Road neighborhood. We were kind of brought in to be a resource for community organizations on the sound transit planning process for the Evergreen Way and Casino Road station. This picture here is from one of our first community meetings about the station planning. And I think the work on that project really hit home to me what a really wonderful and unique neighborhood Casino Road is, and that it's one of those places that really it warrants a lot of its own kind of specific policies and supports because of kind of the unique nature of the neighborhood. And I think as we've been looking at what's relevant to the comprehensive plan, that's been really true as well. I want to acknowledge that this is, that we're having this conversation fairly late in a lengthy comprehensive planning process you all have been very engaged in for quite a while now. But as the organizations that got involved in this work, we really felt like there needed to be this extra attention on the needs of Casino Road, and I think it's sort of a broadly defined area, and we'll talk about the geography a little bit in a second. And that I think the recommendations that we're putting forward today are all things that there is still time to incorporate into the plan. And we're also trying to identify ways that the comprehensive plan can tee up additional work that would happen after so that we are not further delaying the planning process. So we started this work in September, and there's a variety of different ways that we've gotten feedback. We've met twice now with the Connect Casino Road Village Circle. We've also, I'd say the biggest source of input was from Connect Casino Road's community listening session in October. I don't know how familiar many of you are with Connect Casino Road, but it's a coalition of service providers based in Casino Road, and they have just been a tremendous resource for us. We would not have been able to do this work without them and the connections that they have to community members. So really want to emphasize that. There's also an existing affordable housing strategy process going on in Casino Road, and we've been able to talk with the multifamily and homeownership work groups from that process. And we've also been able to work closely with the City of Everett planning staff. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about housing tonight, but we've really tried to address a wide range of issues. And I would say a lot of focus on what are the assets of the neighborhood that people really value and want to see continue. I could go into a ton of detail about every specific piece of feedback that we've gotten. A lot of that, again, is written up in the memo. We have hundreds of these sticky notes from various community activities. So I really want to just emphasize a couple of the most consistent points. One, that affordability, the need for affordability, as well as the benefit of the existing affordability in Casino Road was by far the most common thing that we heard from folks, and also a really strong desire to stay in the Casino Road neighborhood. We heard really consistently across the board from folks that they lived in this neighborhood because it was a community for them, that there were cultural connections that were really unique in Casino Road, that there were businesses that they were able to go to that they wouldn't be able to go to in other parts of the city or the county, that the different institutions, cultural organizations, cultural spaces, service organizations really made this neighborhood a unique place where their lives were based and that they wanted to be able to stay there. And I think this is sort of on this second slide, and some of the other conversations that we had that were more about sort of assets and things, it was a lot of the same message. And just, I bolded this first point because so much of what we heard was, what's great about this neighborhood is that I can walk to all of these different things, similar to what I was just describing. And so those institutions, cultural spaces, and the proximity and walkability of the neighborhood were really important. So coming out of that engagement process, and again, I've kind of skimmed through this quickly, so happy to come back and answer questions. We came up with 7 recommendations, and these are all very interconnected recommendations. So I'm going to kind of talk through each of them briefly, and again, happy to come back and go into more detail. The first recommendation is about housing goal 3, and the policies that are within housing goal 3. This is really sort of the goal on equity in housing, in the city's housing element. And I think, given the type of feedback that we heard about the desire to stay in the neighborhood, the desire for anti-displacement strategies and investments, we really thought that goal 3 could benefit from more of an emphasis on anti-displacement. And kind of balancing the need for those investments with, I think, the still very valid need for access to opportunity throughout the city, right? And but I think what you'll see in some of the specific policy amendments, and I didn't put all of them up here just for the sake of space, but is moving a bit away from some of the language that was more about preventing concentrations of affordable housing, because we really, I think I was worried, and I think there was a concern among other folks that we didn't want any policies in the plan that were going to prevent the city from taking action on targeted investments for the neighborhood. So that first recommendation is very related to the second recommendation, which is about adopting an anti-displacement designation in the urban form element, in the future land use map, in the plan generally. The Puget Sound Regional Council has developed these great maps. There's a lot of data that goes into how they identify places that are high displacement risk. Demographic factors, factors related to real estate, variety of other issues. And as you can see on the map on the right, there's this southern portion of Everett that is one of the highest displacement risk areas in the Puget Sound region from that designation. And while the other little orange area at the top of the map has had a lot of planning already, this area in the south has not, and it incorporates the 2 community hubs that are already scheduled to have a sub-area planning process. So the recommendation is really to build on that process that the city was already planning to do and fill in some of the gap essentially between those 2 nodes. And that as part of doing that, also to delay the upzoning specifically for this new high displacement risk designation that's being created, so to allow time for a sub-area planning process. There's a variety of things that you can do in a sub-area planning process, right, that are more detailed than what you're going to be able to do when you're looking at the entire city in a comprehensive plan. and certainly more than it felt appropriate to recommend that the city try and squeeze into the final stages of the comprehensive planning process at this point. But I actually think, by delaying some of these zoning changes for a sub-area planning process and having a targeted focus on this part of the city, there's a lot of really great opportunities, and there's an opportunity to essentially commit to taking these actions in the comprehensive plan and then follow up subsequently. There are opportunities to, one of the things that you can do in that kind of process is identify key sites that have really valuable, whether it's, naturally occurring affordable housing or, this is a picture of Casino Square, which has a lot of businesses that are really important to the neighborhood. And identify those sites where you might be concerned about redevelopment, what's going to happen to the people or businesses that are there, and identify strategies for acquisition or mitigation for those sites. There's opportunities for capacity building, both for existing CBOs, but also for the creation of a new community development corporation and public development authority. There's an opportunity for more targeted land use and development incentives. And then I want to go into more detail on the final three bullets here, which I've sort of set aside as their own recommendations. Inclusionary zoning, affordable housing on faith-owned land, and corner store designations for Casino Road. For inclusionary zoning is one of the most common anti-displacement tools, right? This is essentially a way to require affordability as part of new development. And it has the benefit, obviously, then of creating that affordability as new development happens. It also levels the playing field a bit between the nonprofits or public entities that would already be building with affordability in mind and the for-profit market sector. But if you don't calibrate an inclusionary zoning program right, you risk really restricting development and not getting the things that you do want to see happen, right? And obviously, if no development happens, the percentage requirement of 0 is 0, and so that is not helpful. In the past, the city has done some studies showing that the real estate market couldn't support an inclusionary zoning program, but we think that a lot has changed, and also there were things that were potentially not studied as part of those earlier studies. There's an opportunity to think about additional cost reductions and incentives that would be part of a program like that. There's opportunities to look more at flexibility, so off-site performance or an in lieu fee, flexibility in the percentage of units, the area median income required, and the period of compliance. And perhaps the most important thing is that inclusionary zoning has to be put in place when an upzone happens under state law. And so if we don't explore inclusionary zoning as part of this upzone for this neighborhood, we can't come back in a year or 5 years and do it later. So the recommendation is not to adopt inclusionary zoning, but it's to commit to exploring it for the reasons that I just mentioned. I also wanted to touch specifically on the incentives for affordable housing on faith-owned land. This is something that we heard from a lot of faith organizations in the neighborhood that they're really interested in. It's also a new state requirement that all cities are required to provide these development incentives. And really, there should be a standard offering that folks can take advantage of. So this is work, essentially that the city is already going to need to do at some point. And there's an opportunity, though, I think, again, this is something that you want to have designed appropriately to the users and to the underlying zoning. And one of the, I think the great things is that in a lot of the faith-owned land in the neighborhood, there's already a lot of capacity to build under the current zoning. So I think there's some work to do to figure out what would be an incentive that would actually be valuable and help further those affordable housing projects. And then the last of sort of these subtopics is the corner stores. I think it's really great that Everett's already looking at allowing small scale commercial uses in residential neighborhoods. But one of the challenges of having that based on corners, literal corners, is that sort of assumes your traditional street grid pattern. And a lot of Casino Road is not really built that way. And I just screen grabbed this image of one little section of the neighborhood, but you can see these loops, right, rather than continuous grid. And also that a lot of these streets are actually privately owned streets. So whether the corner store designation would apply to them at all is unclear. So I think there's an opportunity to think about a different type of spacing. If you still want to have spacing between those commercial uses, maybe there's another way to space them that is more appropriate for the street designs that you have in this neighborhood. And I think that also then opens up an opportunity in the sub-area planning process to do some more community engagement about what kinds of uses people would really like to see closer to their homes, to not have to walk over to Evergreen Way or drive over to Evergreen Way to get to. And I think we heard a lot about kind of the value of those accessible small businesses and cultural uses in our engagement. So I think there'd be a lot of interest in providing additional feedback on this specific policy. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is about housing sizes, building types, and tenures, really the diversity of housing across all of those spectrums. One of the things that we also heard really consistently was that there's no one particular housing type that everybody needs. What they need is a neighborhood that has a variety of those housing types, so that all of the different types of households that make up the community can have housing that fits their needs. And so this is true in terms of unit sizes, large family-sized apartments, also small places for single individuals. It's true for, some people really want to live in a townhome, some people want to live in a bigger apartment building. And for tenure, we heard a lot of interest both in rental and home ownership. I think this is another place where I want to, I think congratulate the city, and that there's a lot of really great policies that you guys already have along these same lines. So I don't actually have any recommendations for policy changes in the housing element or the urban form element, but I do think that as you're actually moving into the specific code development, which I know you're already talking about on a variety of fronts, that keeping this in mind and thinking about what are the opportunities to encourage diversity, right? You don't necessarily want, for example, a missing middle zoning code that encourages everybody to build the exact same type of townhome on every lot, right? How can you encourage people to experiment and have a couple different typologies that work really well? There's some related building code changes that the state has recently allowed cities to or made it easier for cities to adopt, and the state potentially is eventually going to adopt those in the state building code that I go into more detail in the memo about. And there's also, in addition to incentives for affordability, there's also, an opportunity to have incentives for different unit types. There's also, there's a new state requirement for what the state calls co-living, which I think your code currently refers to as dormitory style housing, essentially, rooms with shared kitchens, that allowing that in more residential areas. And I think for meeting that single individual who just needs an affordable place to live there's an opportunity there to potentially make those updates to allow that in more places before the state requirements go into effect, not having to wait. I think it's I think it's the end of next year, but it might even be a little later than that when that goes into effect. And then I also just wanted to add, and again, this is just something to keep in mind essentially, but as we're thinking about these different housing types, we heard from a lot of people, well, I don't mind having a small apartment. I don't need my own big yard, but if I don't have my own yard, I need a park nearby that's going to have those same amenities that I can access, where I can get together with my extended family or friends, or I can take my kids, things like that. So thinking about the ways that housing types and the amenities within apartment buildings or other types of housing kind of fit and complement the types of amenities and open spaces in the neighborhood and the investments the city's making there is another thing that I wanted to highlight from the feedback we got. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Alex. Wanted to give an opportunity for the Planning Commission to ask some questions, and ultimately what we are looking for is some feedback on some of these recommendations. Staff are digesting these. I think some of these are some really weighty issues. I really appreciate the work that the whole team has put into this. I really appreciate the engagement that they've done on the ground in the community. It has extended our ability to do the same, and I think they've gotten some really good feedback that we have taken seriously as we have received it over time and continue to do so. Process-wise, we talked about the housing element just about first. It is the focus of this periodic update. It's the biggest need and the biggest problem that we're looking to solve as much as we can through the comprehensive plan and the development regulations. We will, in the next year, as I said in the opening staff comments, where we've got most of the big elements that we've brought through at least once. Transportation is the one that we'll be diving into in January. And then we have a few other elements, and then we'll do a round of bringing it all together. And I think at that time of bringing it all together is when we'll see a next draft of the housing goals and policies. So we'll take any kind of feedback and responses and reactions that you have today, and any that come from the public or other organizations or folks who are watching these issues. And we'll bring that back to you either in a dedicated item on housing, because it is so important and it is dependent on some of these other elements that we've gone through. So it kind of makes sense to start there and end there. So you can expect some more discussion on housing in general. And I agree with Alex's portrayal of the Casino Road neighborhood as warranting some special attention for several reasons. I think the light rail and the changes that are and the market pressures that it will bring to the neighborhood, its history of checkered attention, I think I could say, and some of the ongoing displacement pressures that we're facing, and that's one of the real key issues that we're charged with tackling as part of this periodic update. So there were 6, I think, broad recommendations. We can talk a little bit about each one of them. I think things like the corner stores are in one bucket of maybe less impactful to the core as inclusionary zoning and delaying zoning changes. And then there's some others that are in the middle. I think we've had conversations in a group setting. City staff have participated with LISC's convening of an affordable housing task force, and then the economic development strategy, and then the subsequent enabling environment and housing production committees. So we've been doing a lot of work along the way, and we've had a lot of very productive discussions. And I think we share the same goals. Definitely making sure that folks who live in a neighborhood, in a community, and who want to stay there are able to stay there is one of those goals. Wanting the neighborhood to grow and to accept new neighbors, continue its core, and then see what comes next. All of those things, I think, are shared goals. There are the pathways to get there that I think nobody knows the perfect answer to. I've told Alex and the team I'm hesitant about delaying zoning changes, and I'm torn on inclusionary zoning as a concept. I can't remember if Alex talked about the mechanics of it, but that's essentially a requirement that you would attach to a rezone that provided additional development capacity that would require that any housing development either provide affordable housing as part of that development or pay a fee in lieu that would go towards the production of affordable housing. So it's elegant in that it meters the production of affordable housing at the same rate as that you produce market rate housing. And so it can enable some stability for different economic segments. A lot of the studies that we've participated in or read, or there's the South Everett Economic Development Study that our Economic Development Department is leading. There's all of the different projects and sub-projects that you heard about today. There's a lot of affordable housing in the neighborhood, and not a lot of it is protected long-term. In other words, being a covenant with a 50-year affordability period or housing authority and things like that. So it is vulnerable to displacement, the dwelling units themselves and the residents themselves. I worry about the chilling effect on development and housing production in the neighborhood. We've talked about this, I think, when we were going through the housing element. And I worry about that being equally impactful and equally contributing to displacement pressure. I think of a couple different specific routes to the displacement of a household, which would be their undesired, not their choice, being priced out of a neighborhood or directly having their housing lease terminated and the housing torn down for new development or something. And the main routes that I can see are one in which a affordable apartment complex, let's say a small apartment complex that rents at affordable rates, being purchased, torn down, rebuilt at higher rates with a new product and potentially more units. So the folks who were living in there maybe have a hard time finding a replacement housing units in the neighborhood and then need to leave the neighborhood altogether. Not a good outcome. The other is that we don't add more housing, market rate, affordable or otherwise, and there continues to be population growth, there continues to be displacement pressures in other areas of the region, and all it takes is for one household to outcompete an existing household in the neighborhood by just enough. And landlords, of course, it's their job to find the rent and the stability and the different attributes of a renter that enable their business to work. And that, I would say, is ongoing already. It's been going on, and it continues to go on, and it will continue to go on. The first one is very visible. You see an affordable apartment complex or a house or triplex or what have you coming down, and you see the people packing their bags. The second one is less visible, and I couldn't tell you which one is more, well, I can tell you that the second one is happening now and the first one isn't happening very much because we haven't had a lot of housing development in that neighborhood. So I will, I guess, leave it for now at staff understands the gravity of this, shares the goals, is hesitant about especially the delayed zoning change, but also the inclusionary zoning. But we completely understand the rationale behind it, and I think I've conveyed to this commission before that it is not only can reasonable people disagree about which route is the right one to go, but highly trained experts, academia, everybody is, I think, wrestling with this one right now. So I'd love to hear some of your perspective, and we can talk about the big one, and then maybe we can talk about the little ones like the corner store one.
Quick question, and then is it Commissioner Shelby? You have a question or comment next. What is the impact of delaying upzoning on our capacity? Because we have certain goals, certain targets that are based on the capacity that includes upzoning that part of the city. So if it were not upzoned, what is the impact?
I don't know the exact number, but when we did our land capacity analysis on the three alternatives 6 months ago maybe, we had enough capacity with alternative 3, which is the one that was the basis for the zoning maps that we're working with now, but barely. That was with the assumptions that we had. If you build out every parcel to its maximum, we have lots and lots and lots of capacity, but that's not how it goes. You might have a 15-story zoning and someone might build townhouses, and you have to account for that, and you have to account for the fact that some parcels the owner is not interested in selling. So there are a lot of assumptions that I think I tortured you with a very long presentation on. That would say that if you accept those assumptions, that delaying the zoning would delay successful accommodation of our growth targets. State law does allow potentially, I'm not sure about this, I haven't done all the research, but maybe Alex knows that there is a route for displacement specifically as a reason to delay and do a little bit more work. So I will accept that it is possibly legal, but it would delay the successful provision of the capacity. One last thing is, where is Casino Road? I think we know where the road is, but where is the neighborhood? Sorry if you covered this, but it is, yeah, why don't you say it, like where you're thinking?
Well, so just kind of going back to this map, and you actually have some maps that you're working on that might point to this a little bit more clearly, but so the dark orange it almost looks to me like sort of an animal running or something. In the southern portion of the city, that's the high displacement risk area. A good portion of the western part of that is industrial land and parks. So if you can sort of imagine taking that portion out, you have a slightly more kind of, a little bit of a corridor that goes essentially along Evergreen Way from Casino Road to the future Casino Road station to the future Mariner station, with a little bit of more area kind of at the top around the Casino Road and Evergreen Way intersection. That's again the geography that I'm proposing, given that the Puget Sound Regional Council has done a lot of work to kind of identify that is the area that has sort of this shared, these shared concerns. Now we don't know exactly where the people that we got community input from live within this geography, right? We know generally that they're from kind of this part of South Everett. Many of them walked to the community meetings we had that were at essentially just off the intersection between Casino Road and Evergreen Way. And so, you know, we're making a couple assumptions here, and obviously there's room to tailor the specific geography that you want to look at. I think we're putting this forward as a starting place to think about what would make the most sense.
So my follow-up question, which you probably don't have an answer to, but I'm just going to say it, is what would be the realistic time frame that a sub-area plan could be, all of the elements conducted and researched and finalized in order to upzone that? So I don't expect that you would necessarily have that answer offhand, but that would be an additional piece of information that I think we would really need to know. Commissioner Shelby?
Yeah, I just had a couple of quick, well, probably not quick questions. As far as the inclusionary zoning that you're proposing or asking, for, is it limited explicitly to the Casino Road potential sub-area?
That would be the idea, again, that it would be specifically for this sub-area, with the idea that because of the higher displacement risk, because you have so many people that are in housing that is, reasonably priced but not protected by any regulations, that is particularly needed in this part of the city. And I think given some of the overall production concerns that Yorick mentioned too, one of the ways that I generally think about that, right, the supply needs and the impact that that has on displacement are really regional, and or at least citywide, right? That the less we build housing as a region, the more rents are going to go up, the more people are going to get displaced. But the construction impacts, the impacts of replacing a lower cost older building with a higher cost newer building are very neighborhood based. And so this is a way to ideally get the benefits of protecting from that sort of neighborhood-based displacement through redevelopment, while limiting the amount that we're impacting and delaying the overall increases in housing capacity to meet that regional supply need.
I guess in my initial take, this is the first I've looked at it. It seems like somewhat of a, I'm going to use the term like a redlining, but more in an economic sense, right? Like you're either going to restrict housing in this particular area, or you're going to force it to be too expensive to construct comparatively to the rest of the city, and potentially certainly to the southern part of that map, where the city is responsible for a corner, and the rest of it goes to the county, and the county can do whatever the county would like. And so that would be my initial reservation about implementing it in that specific area, is that there may be not enough economic growth there, or maybe we want to spread this a little bit more across the rest of the city and do a citywide inclusionary zoning type thing. It seems that putting it in one particular area, we're asking people, again, to just kind of concentrate in the particular housing types in an area where, as a city, we've said, hey, we really don't want to do that. And that seems counterproductive to go back and just do that again.
A couple of responses to that. I mean, I think there's sort of I would say two philosophies sort of for how do you address the sort of history of inequities in our housing systems and sort of the continued presence of kind of different conditions on the ground in different parts of the city, right? And so one philosophy is we should stop treating these places differently. We should treat them all the same, as a way to kind of move beyond the way that we have historically discriminated against certain parts of the city, right? And then there's a philosophy that says we need to recognize that this history has happened and proactively continue to treat those places differently to undo what has happened. I think then the further counter to that, right, is, do we actually know that we're undoing and not continuing to do harm? So, I mean, I think, again, the recommendation here is for kind of that second approach, that this neighborhood needs something different, or at least needs something more. We didn't do engagement all across the city and sort of look at the possibility of doing inclusionary zoning citywide. So I'm not necessarily saying you shouldn't do that, but I don't feel like we've done the analysis or community engagement to justify me recommending to you all that the city should be doing that. I also want to make sure you're all aware that the county does have inclusionary zoning around Mariner Station. So that's already in place. So what you actually have right now is a system where that's being required on the other side of the line and not in the city. So I think that's probably something that is going to be important in thinking about this. And then I also just want to emphasize that what I'm recommending is to study this, and that there's a lot of things that would go into from that study that you would then use to figure out, is this the right thing to do? And I think thinking about some of the questions that you're asking of what would the impact be of doing this just in one part of the city have on kind of the disparities that we see citywide, could be part of the study that you would do on whether this is a good policy, whether inclusionary zoning is a good policy to adopt or not.
York, this is fast, I think. I'm not asking for an answer right now, but for next time, we should find out what bordering policies or rules or goals the county is doing. Because if there's inclusionary zoning there, is it anywhere else? Maybe that's the only one, but are there other things that we're not considering?
Do you know, Alex, did the county finish, they may be at adoption of that? It was included in the recommendation to the county council, but last I checked, they weren't finished with it. But yes, the county.
Maybe I should clarify. I think they've adopted their comprehensive plan, which directs them to adopt an inclusionary zoning policy. I don't actually know if they've adopted the development regulations.
That's okay, my request
We'll get a
stands.
report. Yes, absolutely, yeah. By the next time, we'll get a report on that. And we do have a policy in the existing housing element, no, the latest draft of the housing goals and policies from July, which is number 2.2, participate in regional mandatory inclusionary zoning efforts. So the last time we looped around this question, there was concern that by adopting it in Everett, then you depress the housing production and it goes elsewhere. The county does have one. Does that qualify as regional? It is one of our neighbors of this specific area, so we'll take a look at that.
Doesn't Everett already have programs, incentives to offsets, things to kind of encourage or provide some incentive for, I guess, affordable or lower income development, or at least in parts of projects?
We do. Let me see if I can remember many of them. We have probably the most powerful one is the multifamily tax exemption for 12 years. If you include 10% of the units in the building to affordable to 60% area median income, and then another 10% to 80% area median income. So that will get you 12 years, no property tax on your development. We also offer the 8-year without the affordability requirement. We did the housing development incentives program work. That was the consultant review of our development feasibility, and they had some of the recommendations on our incentive programs. And one of the findings from that was when we felt like the city's housing development market had matured to the right point, that we should pare back the 8-year MFTE and not give the tax break away without something in return other than housing. To start, housing is enough of a public benefit that it's worth it, but at some point we could pare that back. Some middle options, I'm always looking for middle grounds, is to do some of that early in South Everett potentially, and say if you're gonna get the multifamily tax exemption that you need to provide affordability. We also have a density bonus or a height bonus for providing affordable units in many of our zones, our height map districts. It is arranged 4 to 6 floors, 7 to 9 floors, 15 to 25 floors, I think, downtown. To get the higher number, you need to provide some public benefit, and there's a menu of options, one of which is affordable housing. The consultant's review last year on that, or 2 years ago, was that the affordable housing one was so much more expensive than all the rest of them that they didn't expect that one to be used, and it hasn't been used in the past. Could be a matter of tweaking the other ones, but we are strongly considering recommending pulling back from that height development incentives program, again recognizing that housing production and buildings is its own public benefit that shouldn't have to be charged for. And then we have system development fee, the utility connection charges, and impact fee waivers and reductions for affordable housing that I think are more at like the 50% AMI range. So there are a lot of incentives and available. There are several incentives available. I want to say that most of the use of those comes with developers that are building affordable as their primary business or nonprofit model. Haven't seen a lot of private market development say, okay, I will add 20% just so I can get this incentive. And I think because the cost of it maybe doesn't justify the benefit. All of that can be tweaked and adjusted, but that's a
And I guess I was just asking, I mean, inclusionary zoning I see is a little more mandatory. But maybe there's some middle ground, other tools to encourage that. But maybe as you indicated there, I mean, if private developers aren't taking advantage of the voluntary incentives, I guess it's hard to think why they would then choose to take on projects in areas where those things, if they don't pencil out voluntarily in a mandatory setting. But I guess what strikes me the most is we're talking about this area. I guess I don't follow maybe the sound transit planning and the rail. Every once in a while I look and see, but this neighborhood I think is going to be massively impacted by that. And I mean, I was just commenting, I rode the light rail on Friday morning. I could not believe the ridership. I mean, these trains were packed at 7:38 in the morning. I can't imagine if just the land that's going, the space it's going to take up to build the tracks to prepare for that, yet alone then the ridership and the development that's going to follow. I mean, this neighborhood's going to get hit hard. And I guess to me it seems anticipating that is going to be difficult potentially, except to me it seems like I can't anticipate anything other than just massive growth and more activity and pressure to add more there. And these things are being thrust upon this neighborhood in many ways. I understand I guess to me it just seems almost inevitable and difficult to think that you could mitigate that, and I mean, people are going to be impacted, and I just don't know. I wonder if at some level you just have to say, I don't know, that you can do much about that, and try to find some other way to embrace it, provide some other, other avenues. But it just seems to me it's coming, and this neighborhood's going to get hard. And for all the negative potential impacts on people who are there now, there's also the offsetting benefits of how that's going to transform potentially the city and provide other opportunities in other ways. I don't know. I guess that's what strikes me is it realistic to think that you can mitigate, I guess, what maybe some people call progress, or other people maybe damage, but it's big, it's massive. If that happens, it's coming, it's going to be transformative. I don't know. That's what occurs to me when I'm seeing this for this area of the city.
I guess just for a quick note of context on that, so we'll be choosing, the Sound Transit Board will be choosing a preferred alternative for the light rail station locations potentially next year, deciding for good by the end of the 2020s. We would expect construction in the 2030s and opening day in South Everett in either the late 2030s or very early 2040s. And we are planning a sub-area plan. Well, already it's in action in the urban forum goals and policies that we went through for the light rail station areas. We're waiting to know exactly where the station is to have maximum effect on that planning process.
So I was saying in some ways too, until they decide on where the route's going to be and where those stations are going to be, it's going to be hard to maybe do some of that planning as well.
I'd love to respond to some of your comments, Commissioner Yanasak. Because I feel like I didn't emphasize the impact of the light rail construction as much as I probably should have in the initial presentation. That is a huge piece of the context here, right? And I think it's also a big piece of the context around the idea of asking developers to contribute something that is towards a public good for the city, for the neighborhood. We're making an enormous multi-billion-dollar investment in this new transit infrastructure that has the potential to really drive property values, redevelopment, new businesses, all sorts of new opportunities for the neighborhood, right? And the goal is, how do we enable the current residents to stay and benefit as much as possible from that, rather than having that just be a process that displaces them and there are new people that come in and benefit from those changes. And I think that, my intent certainly is not to try and stop that from happening to say that we should just try and freeze the neighborhood in amber. This is not a recommendation to not upzone the neighborhood or to downzone it. This is a recommendation to have a minor delay and look at what accompanying policies might allow more folks to stay. And I also want to emphasize, we've been talking a lot about the inclusionary zoning piece of this, but I think in my mind, actually more important than the inclusionary zoning is the time for the nonprofit and public sector to identify acquisition opportunities. This is a chance now to buy buildings and land before we see a lot of that escalation in property values. And that then means that those places can be either maintained as they are or redeveloped in many cases, but with a kind of public good in mind. Affordable housing, community-oriented businesses, there's a wide variety of things, right, that then could be integrated into that. And I would say that one of the things that's going to keep the property values down in the near term, whether you decide to adopt inclusionary zoning in the long run or not, is the possibility that that will be there. I mean, the way that inclusionary zoning, typically the kind of a consultant calculations that they come in and do is they say, we want to impose a requirement that is going to cost the same amount as the value that's created by the upzone. So you own this property, if it gets, you can build 2 more stories, that's another $1 million, let's say, depending on the size of your property. And so we're going to impose an inclusionary zoning requirement that reduces the rents that you can charge on some units that over time would equal out to that same $1 million that we're essentially giving you in additional capacity. So I think by delaying the upzones and by looking at the possibility of doing inclusionary zoning, if that kind of value capture is possible, it's a way to maintain the current land values, to give time for the nonprofits, for your housing authority and other public entities to identify the most important places and develop acquisition strategies for those. So I think inclusionary zoning is part of kind of the ecosystem of making that happen, but I actually think it's this other piece that in my mind is the most important reason to consider doing a delay.
If I could just ask, I mean, what you were just talked about the timeline for Sound Transit, I mean, we're still talking 10, 15 years out. Isn't that a lot of time? And the other question I would have is, I mean, the market already is aware of all these things. Isn't it too late? I mean, wouldn't this argument always exist? You always need to wait, you need to wait, you need to wait. But at some level, hasn't the market already factored in those possibilities? Right now, it's already too late, in a sense.
I mean, I think from what we've seen in other stations, the property values start to go up closer to construction. They do before the stations open, and in some ways, a significant number of years before. But because we're 10 to 15 years out, we're early enough that hasn't really happened yet. And so this is the moment, and I think there's actually not that much more time to wait. There is, and I don't have like the precise sort of examples from other places to give you right now, but I mean, I think there is going to be a time when it is too late, or you start to see those prices go up and it becomes harder and harder. And this is a moment where I think we are early enough that we can get ahead of some of those things.
Exactly what you just mentioned there was what I was going to ask you for, which is examples of where adopting policies like this has helped, has worked, has stopped the displacement. I grew up in Seattle, where there used to be Black neighborhoods, where they do not exist anymore. And of course, the establishment of some of the Black neighborhoods was caused by redlining. And you gave a very good description of what you were talking about, which was not redlining. Redlining was, of course, banks colluding and saying, we will not lend for Black families or other families, perhaps Italian, whatever the discriminating element was being directed at, whoever those families were, and saying, we're not going to lend to those folks. And then the market saying, we also will not sell to those folks within the boundaries of these red lines. And so that's what created some of these neighborhoods in Seattle and other areas, and they don't exist anymore, and the city isn't the same. It's a totally different feel. It's lost a lot of the elements that made it a place that I loved growing up there. And so I would hate to see that happen here in Everett. I think that's one thing that we all agree on this dais we do not want to see, is the elements of our city that make it special and unique, and that where we have those safe havens for marginalized groups to feel like they have community connection and access to one another and to their culturally significant spaces. But at the same time, we still have to balance the needs of the future residents of this city to have housing. And that's been the challenge that we've been discussing up here for since we've all been up here. And so it would be helpful to know the impacts of what you're asking us to consider, and to give us examples of where what you're asking us to consider, where that has succeeded and has produced the outcome that you're describing. And so without those things, I guess it's difficult. It's difficult to kind of land on where we might feel one element is more or less useful.
This is obviously my first time getting to meet all of you and kind of having this conversation. I think part of my intent today was to find out what additional information would be useful. What were the areas of concern that you all had? And I know that the clock is ticking a bit, but I think if there's an opportunity to come back or just work with York to provide some materials to you there, I would say Seattle actually, in my mind, is a good example in many ways. Seattle did not have an inclusionary zoning program until 2018, and so so the displacement that you were just describing, right, all happened before that program was in place. It's not a silver bullet. It's not inclusionary zoning. I don't want to, create the impression that that's going to somehow completely solve those problems, but it is a tool that creates affordability as development happens that I think, in Seattle, a lot of the program is sort of tilted towards the fee in lieu version of this. So most developers, instead of actually building the affordable housing on site, they're providing funding that goes to the city's Office of Housing. That has some downsides, but the upside of it is that the Office of Housing has been able to make targeted investments, and there's been a big focus specifically on investments in housing that is marketed towards people who've been displaced from neighborhoods that have particular cultural importance to them and are then able to come back through those new affordable housing programs. And there's been a set of policies around sort of a right to return that allows preference for those folks to move into those buildings. The Central District, the historically black neighborhood in Seattle, is one of the places that there's several new affordable housing projects that have been funded in part through those in lieu fees that are trying to get at some of those opportunities. And obviously that's very late in the process, right after most of that displacement has already happened. So I think the other thing is that Everett has a chance to look at these strategies a lot earlier and integrate them at a point where you're able more to be focused on helping people stay in their home, stay in their neighborhood, and not having to try and find ways for people to come back after they've had to leave.
It's a little bit of a switch gears question.
Well, I guess maybe I could say,
Yeah.
on the same topic, let's say you implemented a very successful anti-displacement policy, robust and with various, not just inclusionary zoning, other aspects, whatever it is. What percentage of the, the current population that you're hoping to not displace are you realistically able to save? Could you get to 50%? Or are we talking maybe 10% anyway? Or or can't you even know that?
I mean, I think it, this is, I guess, also part of why I'm suggesting a sub-area planning process, because I think that depends on so many different variables. We're trying to do a very sort of small, essentially community engagement and sharing of policy lessons from our experience working in other places to kind of get this conversation going and ideally kind of lead to additional policy work and analysis that might get to some of the answers to that question. So I feel like, but I guess I would say there's a certain critical mass, right, of people from a community that need to be able to stay in order for that neighborhood to still feel like it is of and connected to that community, and that can vary. But you'd want to think about, what for Casino Road, what would that look like? And I'll just, going back to the Seattle example, that's where I grew up and live now. I think about the Central District and Capitol Hill, two neighborhoods next to each other that both are sort of neighborhoods that have a connection to a particular community, the Central District to the Black community in Seattle, Capitol Hill to the LGBTQ community in Seattle. And I think for those two communities, right, that kind of percentage threshold of critical mass is different. And just as one example, right, that Capitol Hill has seen a similar pretty dramatic reduction in, if you look at the census data on same-sex households or same-sex partner households, for example, there's been a big reduction in that, but you still see like most of the gay bars, most of the a lot of other LGBTQ gathering places are still in that neighborhood. I think you could say a similar thing, right, about Black churches in the Central District. Many of them are still located in the Central District, even though large portions of their congregations are having to commute in further and further to go to services. But I think that, my external impression is that that strain has been bigger than for a community like the LGBTQ community, where there's often a very small percentage of folks in a given neighborhood. So I think, in terms of thinking about, like, for example, for the Latino community in Casino Road, right, like what would be the threshold that would be enough to support the existing grocery stores, for example, that are specifically targeted to that community. I mean, there's a variety of analysis you could do to think, well, like, how many customers does a grocery store need? What's the radius that you would look at, right? Like, we haven't done any of that analysis, but there are ways to try and get at that question of, like, what are the cultural anchors that you're trying to support, and then what are the things that you need to do, or what's the size of the community that's needed for those anchors to be able to stay there and flourish?
So I kind of have a little bit different, but question. I'm having a hard time formulating it because I'm thinking of like two separate things, but I feel like they're related. So for Casino Square specifically, Councilmember Zarlingo has mentioned this to me previously, that this particular square of businesses has been working really hard to try to figure out how to save themselves or stay in the neighborhood, right? Which is exactly why we're having this conversation right now. How does that kind of relate to the Cornerstone topic? Is that a direct example of something that you're, and adding on to this would be, you didn't call it land buyback? You said something earlier, or nonprofit? Help me out a little bit.
Yeah, just like nonprofit or public
Yeah,
acquisition of land. Buying the land, basically.
Could that be an example of something that you would want to do with that availability, right? Because I know it's not owned by those businesses.
Right.
They
Yeah.
probably would like to own it.
Yeah, so that would be a place, right, where they're buying a little time to figure out, is there a nonprofit entity or a public entity that could buy that land and steward it with the mission of, community-centered economic development, supporting community-centered entrepreneurship, right? And maybe that means keeping it just the way it is, or maybe that means actually redeveloping it, but in a way that is sensitive to the long-term needs of those businesses. And I think, and then there's an alternative strategy, right, which is finding another piece of land somewhere nearby that has all of the same qualities that those businesses need to co-locate together and do well, and coming up with some kind of relocation strategy. I think those are kind of the two directions that the business community there is interested in. And again, this gives us time to, and that's just one of the parcels, right? Maybe there's a half dozen that the community says, these are the 6 places that are the most important that we really need to come up with a strategy for.
Yeah, it's complicated.
When you say gives time, are you anticipating that the zoning changes and then all of a sudden the values increase significantly? Is that the assumption?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that math works like that. I mean, just based on what we've seen in other areas of the city, zoning has changed and development has not quickly changed, nor have property values. So I think that, I'm not sure that I necessarily immediately buy into that assumption. It could be pressed and tested, I think, at least looked in other areas of the city and see what's happened. I do agree that there is kind of a hockey stick effect on land values as you approach closer and closer to the time when the station gets built and turned online. But it strikes me that, these acquisition strategies you're talking about from a nonprofit standpoint, that could happen now. There's no barrier to that. Everett Housing Authority could, elect to make an acquisition on Casino Road, just like they elected to buy the Stone Gardens on Rucker. That's no different. So I'm not really sure about this timing component. I'm not, maybe not understanding it.
There are there's a lot of active work going on right now. I mean, I want to point out my colleagues over here who are working with a lot of those, folks, including the Everett Housing Authority, other organizations, to try and do just that now, right? But it does take time to identify the financing, to figure out which land you want to prioritize. I mean, there are a variety of steps that need to happen to actually make that. It's not necessarily a lot of time that we need. Maybe it's just a year, but if these zoning changes happen now, even if development is not happening, right, those zoning changes and whatever other, regulations come with them, I do think are going to be priced into what people are going to be considering paying for the land. And you're going to have some people that are thinking very long-term that potentially are going to start buying up land early because they also know that other people will be paying attention later and the prices are going to be going up. So, there will be other changes that will happen more gradually. I'm not saying that the moment that the zoning changes, like you're going to see the neighborhood completely change, but I do think that it's just going to make it that much harder for a lot of these entities to buy these properties when, frankly, we don't have enough resources to do all of what we would want to begin with. So anything that we can do to prevent land values from further going up before some of this work can be completed is going to save the government money, essentially, right? Like we can use some policy strategies so that buying that piece of land is only going to be $10 million instead of $12 million. That's $2 million that a nonprofit or the city or another entity can spend on something else that we want to do.
Sure, thank you. 3 softball questions. So there was a note in here about providing for affordable housing incentives for faith-based organizations, wouldn't want to do that for anybody that own land, not just faith-based organizations. We want to create more affordable housing, period, right? So I would say that the limiting component of that is curious to me. Were landowners included in your focus groups in this study? And if so, what was the composition of those property owners? And what kind of representation was it? 60% of property owners participated, or 5%, excluding faith-based? And then, I guess the final question, well, go ahead, I'll get to that.
See, so your last question, I mean, I don't want to oversell the scale of this engagement. We did not talk to any, I mean, there were some people who were property owners who ended up being engaged in the process, but we did not do like a survey of property
Sure,
owners for this. There is a recommendation to provide those incentives across the board. That's one of the recommendations in there. There's a specific recommendation to do a faith-based incentive, both because it's required by state law and because we know that there are a variety of faith institutions that are interested. And so thinking about an incentive that would work for the land that they have and the zoning that they're currently under, I think is something just from a practical perspective that is sort of taking advantage of existing parties that want to do affordable housing.
That makes perfect sense. I want that to extend to all property owners, not just faith-based owners. My last question had to do with the sub-area group, the planning. What are the implications of that type of plan? Is there a downside to that?
Doing a sub-area plan?
Yeah.
We are planning to do a sub-area plan centered on the light rail station area for the physical development and some of these market effects that we expect to come through this. A sub-area plan, I think, doesn't need to be anything more than the type of planning that we already do, but focused in a specific area. It enables you to look at individual parcels. It enables you to look at infrastructure components in great deal, maybe even have some specific design, whether on the public side or the private side, components. So we're planning on doing it. The geography that I think we were contemplating, the action that's in the urban forum goals and policies was around community hubs. So I think that would be more tightly focused on the intersection of Evergreen Way and Casino Road, plus a half mile, a mile or so around it. So if this sub-area plan was to be all of South Everett, or at least west of I-5, then that would be different than we had anticipated it, but planning effort can take many different shapes and sizes, and that could go into the comprehensive plan, could be reflected in development regulations, could be reflected in capital facility and other public investment.
Well, I would encourage the sub-area plan. I think that Mr. Brennan had kind of outlined extending that south to the border with Snohomish County. And given the public investments in both of those nodes, I think it makes a lot of sense to think about that. Maybe not with the same level of intensity in planning, but just think about how they connect and how they will grow in the future.
I'm certainly not an expert in inclusionary housing, but my understanding is that the results have been very mixed. And so if you are coming back, it'd be nice to know, if you're coming with examples, it'd be nice to have both and then kind of understand why those didn't work. My understanding is it's very difficult to implement correctly, and that you could just as easily shut down development, shut down both for affordable and market rate on that. Therefore, for me, delaying this for 2 years to study something that may not work would not be supported. However, the displacement risk is huge to me, and I would love to hear maybe other options or policies or plans that you would suggest to help us protect that. Then the co-living, I would strongly support that. And again, I don't know if this is specific to this area, but certainly across areas in the city, that would be a great thing. The single stair also, not sure why we haven't done that. So if we're not doing that, then that's really shame on us, and we should be doing it.
Commissioners, additional questions or comments on this subject? I think since we're moving on to a different subject, we'll just see if we have any public comment. We don't have any sign-in sheets here in person, but do we have anyone online who wishes to comment?
No comments.
Okay, thank you. Okay, last call on this one, commissioners. Okay, thank you so much for being here. This was really excellent information, very informative.
Thanks, Val, for the opportunity to have this conversation.
So heavy stuff, we'll continue working this over among staff. We'll continue the conversations with Alex and the team. We would love to hear from the public or others who are engaged in this in different ways, some more perspectives on it. And I think you can expect to hear more on this topic. It may not be the very next meeting in January because we'll be diving into transportation and some other things. But we will keep this front of mind and we will talk about it again before we wrap this up. Thank you.
Thank you. So we took the agenda a little bit out of order, so we'll go back to agenda item 5, which is the middle housing regulations.
Thank you. Kelsey, go ahead. Got Kelsey Hyde with our land use planning manager and in charge of implementing the regulations that we are working with here. So heavily invested in this. I think Kelsey was with us when we last talked about middle housing in May and June, I think it was, in detail. Yes, expert of many
I don't
things.
think I want that title, but thank you very much.
So tonight, and looking at the clock and thinking maybe 8:30. Okay. Just want to give an update on staff work. We have been working, cranking hard on middle housing regulations. We've been thinking about it as we've gone through the urban form and design and development elements and the goals and policies and actions there, especially. We want to give a little bit of an orientation to the Department of Commerce's, it's got a longer name than that, but I shortened it to Objective Design Standards Toolkit. It is called the Traditional Neighborhood Design Middle Housing Toolkit of Objective Development and Design Standards, Puget Sound Region Detailed Standards. We are using this as a primary source of recommendations and options around the middle housing regulations. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an orientation to what we're using, not to say that this is going to be the answer, but it's a major source that we're working from. And then some of the topics that we talked about in May and June, we have progressed from, at that point, I think everything was listed as options, and then we got some feedback from the Planning Commission. We've gotten feedback from others through our engagement work, and then we've done some work among staff as well. And so for some of these, we're kind of narrowing around a proposal that still has many opportunities to change and morph, but we wanted to touch base on all of that. We'll see what we can do in a half hour. So the Objective Design Standards Toolkit, I'm not going to read the whole long name again, was a product that the legislature funded and the Department of Commerce contracted with some consultants, Opticos, that are, I think, some of the experts or even invented the term middle housing and have been really at the forefront of that work. They're a national firm. I don't think they're located in Washington State. I'm not exactly sure. But consider them experts in the field of middle housing, along with the requirement to accommodate middle housing in our development regulations came in the 2023 state legislative session a requirement that any development regulations be objective and clearly ascertainable by an applicant. So no design review, no saying that a new duplex needs to look similar to its neighbor, or that it must be quality design, or that it must be harmonious, or any other thing that two different people could look at and come to a different conclusion. Is it 10 feet or is it not 10 feet? That kind of a thing. So with both of those in mind, and with the Puget Sound region's architectural legacy and site lot patterns and things like that, over about a year, I think it was, this team of experts in the State Department of Commerce, and I think our own Becky McCrary, long-range planning manager at the time, participated on a task force of local government and other stakeholders who reviewed drafts and things like that. It might have been a different parallel process, the model ordinance, but there is a simple version and a detailed version. Not wanting to do anything easily, apparently, as part of this process. We're going with the detailed standards because I think they provide the most thought out and the most carefully designed set of standards for middle housing to achieve all of the goals of what middle housing should be, fitting into the character of the artist formerly known as single-family zoning, nestling into and providing good performance across a number of areas. Detail means very prescriptive, and there are a lot of standards in here that may challenge us on flexibility and affordability, to the other major goals that we have through this middle housing process. I have no doubt that taking this toolkit exactly would deliver really high quality site planning, architecture, development, and ultimately neighborhoods. I suspect that it would also add some cost, potentially reduce some capacity, and limit some of the flexibility and innovation that we might see in middle housing. So we're going to have to choose kind of a middle path. The way that staff is approaching this is to build out, and we have a complete draft. It's a mess, so we're not sharing it quite yet, but we have a complete draft in 68 pages of code-ready language that is based on these detailed standards. We've been working to take that full package and then pare back from there what may not add enough value. So we're starting with the full level of details and then looking to see what amendments or changes or reductions we might make. There is a user guide. All of this is available on the Department of Commerce Middle Housing webpage. They have more resources than this. There's a ton in there. It's a really great library and set of resources. So all of this is accessible by anybody who's watching. It took me a long time to figure out how this works. I'm still not sure that I understand it all, so we'll do our best to try to relay that. But it involves lanes, I would say. So on this table up on the screen here, you have 4 main lanes for how you do site planning. I think the top one is going to represent most, if not almost all, of the middle housing development, and that is an individual parcel that has already been platted, that is less than 100 feet wide and less than 150 feet deep. That is almost all of the parcels in our new neighborhood residential zone. There are some that are almost right on that, 15,000 square foot lots that are almost exactly that. We probably would want to tweak that number anyways. But that has a much, only some of this book applies to those parcels. So that's the first kind of point to keep in mind. When you start moving into larger and deeper, especially parcels, where like we have in especially South Everett, think along Holly Drive and Upper and Lower Ridge Roads and some of those streets, you have some parcels that are very deep, not so wide, but very deep. Some of those you get into applying, now this is the third one, applying design sites on a pedestrian circulation network. If it's very wide but not too deep, you have applying design sites on an existing right-of-way network where every one of the design sites, which is equivalent to a lot, does connect directly to the existing right-of-way. And then for very, very, very large parcels in the multiple acres, which we have almost none or none in the neighborhood residential zone, you have the walkable neighborhood plan. I think there are elements of the walkable neighborhood plan that we may want to use in our site planning in other zones. Like I think of a couple of our very large sites like the Walmart property that help to guide that into a good neighborhood format. But for neighborhood residential, I would expect almost everything to be in the top 3 and most of that in the top 1. And that table exists in this towards the beginning. The other lane, so that is your site planning lane. The other lane is building types, and there are 9 building types. And for each of these, there is a set of form standards that create a compatible version of this type while allowing a fair amount of flexibility. It prescribes the width and the depth of the building, the height to the eaves, different wings, options for wings, frontage types, porches and stoops and those sorts of things. But you have to pick one of these, and it has to fit into that. We're not sure that this is the right approach, but we're trying our best to understand what it can provide and what the downsides could be. There are 2 examples shown on here of the triplex, fourplex on the top and the side court on the bottom. Each one of these is has its own couple of pages and regulations in this book. I don't know that there are other types of housing that are missing from here. That was one of our concerns, and we've been thinking more along the lines of, and I think we've said it in this setting, setbacks, height limit, lot coverage, and then figure it out from there. So this would be different than that. This would be more prescriptive, but you would be more certain in the outcome of it. Are there any types of housing that aren't one of those that would be allowed in middle housing? We have not come up with one yet. These are the topics that we talked about in May and June and got some kind of advice from you at that point. And then now I'll dive into a couple of the specific topics. Were there any questions about the objective design standards or any of that so far? Okay.
Did you have cottages on there? Is that?
Oh, yes, cottages are on there too. Yes. Half of the time I exclude those from our working documents because we already have a cottage housing chapter, so I figured it may not need as much new. Okay, so height, we talked a lot about this back in the spring, I suppose that was. We currently limit buildings in the single-family zones to 28 feet. That is measured from the base elevation of the building, which is the midpoint of each of the 4 sides. So basically where the building is on the lot. If you have a sloped lot and the building is set far downhill, that's where you measure the height from. If you are right at the sidewalk, that's where you measure height from. In some of our other zones, it's keyed to the sidewalk instead. Remember, we have the state's model ordinance, which is different than the objective design standards. There's a lot of similarities between them. The objective design standards are way more detailed than the model ordinance. One last point, got to remember this is an important one with the model ordinance, with the detailed design standards. This was made to apply to the total variety of places in the Puget Sound region, from very small towns and very low density areas to undeveloped and greenfield areas to built up cities like Everett. There's a lot in here that is probably too small for Everett that may fit elsewhere in the region, but not in a metropolitan center and a metropolitan city. The height in the model ordinance is maximum of 35 feet, and they kick it to the city's development regulations for how you measure that height, which is that base elevation. The objective design standard toolkit in the first lane of multiple buildings on a lot. The height limit is 35 feet. And I believe it uses the same measurement methodology. There are also the lists of the building types, and those have different heights for different building types. Those are expressed in stories, and for many of them, they are limited to 2.5 stories. 2.5 stories with a pitched roof could be or would be 35 feet, but it would preclude the full 3rd floor with a flat roof. And I know the Planning Commission, I think you had recommended allowing that full third floor. So that is one difference in applying these objective design standard toolkits from where we were. And our proposed is, I think, consistent with what we were talking in May and June. I think this is probably because it comes first, got the most discussion back then. This is what we are working with, although you received some written public comment today advocating for more like the 2.5 floors. And I continue to observe that 28 feet to 35 with a flat roof is a significant change. Just keep going here. Lot coverage by building, existing 35% in the RS and the R1 zones, 40% in the R2 and the R2A zones, and then another 5% you get for accessory dwelling units. And this is lot coverage by building, everything that is enclosed and covered by a roof, including carports, not include decks. The model ordinance has a graduated lot coverage, more units, more lot coverage allowed. That's kind of how we do it with the accessory dwelling units, but just that little piece between 45% and 55%. And in the objective design standards toolkit for multiple buildings on one parcel, it uses the flat 60%. If you're using the design sites, it varies and it depends on the type of the building. So the design site standards have zones, 4 different subzones that are proposed in here. I think we would mainly be looking at the medium 1 and the medium 2. We've everything in this draft set of standards, we've left it as a range to allow for the range from small 1 up to medium 2. So in these tables, which are on pages, they're early on in here, around page 20 or so. You have design site standards, which would be the lot or the quasi-lot. And those are, I picked 4 examples here: duplex side-by-side, minimum width for the lot of 46 feet and minimum depth of 85 feet for 3,910 square feet. And then you can see for those other building types, and there are the other 5 beyond this, but I just picked 4 common ones. And then you have building standards for the buildings that match those design sites. And the building standards have limits on sizes of buildings. For duplex side-by-side, that's 48 by 36, which is a 1,700 square foot building footprint on the ground floor. It could be double that with the second floor or more. And then that equates to an effective lot coverage that depends on the building type. And I think this represents a maximum, so that would be 44% for a duplex side-by-side, up to 62% for a courtyard style. So all of them remain in that range of 40 to 60%, although different ways of handling it. Here, still looking at options, but I think somewhere in that range remains kind of the staff recommendation. Not sure on the building lanes yet. Setbacks, we're at currently 20 feet front, 20 feet rear, and 5 feet side. Unless it's a street, then it's 10 feet, and there's a list of exceptions to those setbacks. The model ordinance has 15 feet, same graduated, 15 feet in the front, except 10 feet if you have 3 or more units on the lot. 20 feet for the garage door, so the garage door would need to set back 5 feet, 5 feet on the side, and 15 feet in the rear, except 10 if you have more than 3 units, and 0 if there's an alley. The objective design standards are similar to that. They introduce the concept of a maximum setback so that the building couldn't be in the very middle of a lot. 10 feet minimum in the front and 20 feet maximum. Actually, I want to say it was 15 feet, but we set everything to not be less than 20 feet in a maximum if we go to a maximum, because that's the current setback, so you wouldn't want to force people out of the pattern on the street. Side 5 to 15, and then rear 15. Still working on options for that. And I just want to point,
A
yes.
question for you on the setbacks. There, prior slide, I believe it was. So the part I'm having a hard time with is varying setbacks based on unit density. That's not what setbacks are for. Setbacks aren't for the property, the subject property. They're for the other properties around that property. So I don't know that increasing density on a specific lot would merit a reduction in setbacks in any event.
Same for lot coverage, or different for that one?
I think setbacks should control. So to the extent that the ability to capture, the maximum lot coverage would impact the setback would control.
Okay, yep.
Question. Do you like the setbacks that are being proposed?
I don't love a 10-foot setback in the front yard.
Too big or too small?
Too small.
I just want to know.
Yeah,
Trying to follow that too. The density, so the 10-foot is for a single family, for one unit? I guess we don't want to say single family.
Or a
For a
duplex.
single, or a duplex, the 10 feet. And then what is the 20-foot garage? I guess A and B are messing me up for some reason, probably because it's 8, 15, but.
yeah. I think your house duplex, whatever it is, could come up to 15 feet or 10 feet, but that the garage would have to be set back so that the garage is not even with the rest of the house or in front of it.
So it reduces the look on the snout, but,
Yeah.
but.
We have a similar set of standards already in place for that, actually, just to set the garage further back. It also typically helps in terms of parking, if there's going to be parking in the driveway in between the garage and the street as well, to allow
Yeah,
that space.
I guess I'm thinking the 10 feet, normally seeing that like on a townhouse or something, usually you're a rear alley loaded something where that's, it's kind of out more on a urban street for the 10 feet.
Maybe I was confused, or are you finished?
I'm still confused, but I'm done.
Talking about setbacks and lot coverage densities, I guess I'm not quite understanding the interplay between those. You have both, but I guess, were you talking about just saying maybe get rid of densities, as long as you can fit within the setbacks, you're good?
No,
Because it just seems to me, so there could be some situations where, particularly if you're talking maximum setbacks, if you have, I don't know, the density could, you could just cause a math problem. You can't fit the density with the setbacks, and
that was my point. So I anticipate that there will be some lot geometries that, such that if you were to get the maximum lot coverage of, say, 60%, you would be encroaching within one of the required setbacks. And I'm saying that because setbacks are for neighborhood consistency and character, the setback should control. So maybe you only get 56% lot coverage because of the required setbacks. That's what I was talking about.
I suppose on a bigger lot, if you've got a 60% coverage, you would then have naturally, you'd be well within the setbacks, you'd have you'd be forced to have a bigger yard, essentially.
Sort of, but there would be a maximum setback to the street frontage as you're proposing.
You just you'd have to put it closer to the front, but you'd be essentially forced to have a bigger backyard. Whereas maybe you would rather put a bigger unit on there, or a attached accessory unit. You'd be limited, even though you'd still be within setbacks.
Yeah, how we have it now, and in any case, I think you would need to meet both standards. So the setback wouldn't be reducible just because you can't fit the units with the lot coverage. We do want to keep in mind how the two interplay. You could think of the lot coverage by building is that 40% or whatever the opposite of 60% is, needs to be uncovered by building, whatever it is or wherever it is. In these standards, there are some requirements for shared yards and certain size, and we have some of that in our existing code as well. But that you would need to meet both of those standards.
And to Commissioner Finch's point, if I understand the setbacks aren't necessarily for that unit, it is for the look in the overall sense of the property. What is, who is the coverage, the lot coverage limit for in that setting? Is that also for?
That's for the planner.
Is that yeah? Is that for also aesthetic and community feel, or is there more an environmental reason for that, or what? Why? I guess why have
It's a little bit of
the lot coverage percentage limits that I
It's a little bit of both. It is, we do not have, well, we're proposing to do away with density standards, which limit the number of dwelling units. The lot coverage would mandate that there be around half or somewhere in there of open space. That doesn't necessarily have to be in our current standards, green or pervious or can accept water. It can be. I think that is one of the core neighborhood character, if you will, of these areas, is that they're not completely covered by buildings and that there are trees and lawn and open space, and that's an important part of middle housing is extending that feel of the neighborhood while accommodating more housing.
I don't love lot coverage restrictions, other than the fact that I think there's some environmental concerns to just having nothing but buildings. But I do like increasing lot coverage as an incentive to meet our housing needs. So I do like that concept. But I agree with Commissioner Finch that the lot cover, the frontage and the setback issues are, I guess I think that should kind of be where we try to focus our controls. I just think that people should be allowed to use their property to the maximum benefit as long as it is not negatively impacting the environment. So I'm just not a big fan of some of the restrictions on lot coverage.
I guess that's kind of where I was leaning too. It seems to me that why restrict that, particularly if we're trying to encourage, make it, middle housing makes it easier if you can make it a little bigger, and as long as you're within the setbacks and you've controlled those. Environmentally, I mean, people having their lawn is probably one of the least environmental things they can do if they're maintaining it and everything, so.
I think I'm not opposed to what you guys are saying. I guess I would want more information before I really had a strong opinion on that. And so if there are other municipalities that have adopted kind of no restrictions on lot coverage, especially if they had similar characteristics to either Everett today or where we want it to go, I would be very interested in seeing that.
Sure. In our proposed zoning, the low-rise zone, the UR4 zone, is not far from middle housing, except that it has very high lot coverage. Maybe, we haven't finished that, but maybe even 100% lot coverage. So that's what would differentiate the kinds of buildings and the kind of development you could get in those areas from the rest of the city. Usually neighborhood residential is not where you have the best transportation accessibility, the best access to shops and daily needs and everything. Those are the places that were zoned higher. We aren't limiting the number of units on a lot, but a lot coverage would effectively limit in some way the number of homes there and would drive the more significant development to the places that are probably more well-equipped to handle it. But we need housing too, so nothing's easy here.
Okay, so we kind of paused you. You have 7 minutes, York.
Yep, I think we're getting there. With this image, just a reminder with the setbacks that we have a variety of relationships between rights-of-way lines or property lines and the actual street. So on the left side is East Drive, and the red line is the front lot line or the right-of-way line, and you can see that's right at the street. And then on the right side, that's Wetmore and Rockefeller. You have 10, 15 feet of yard before you even get to the property line, and so the setback applies the same on both of them. We're looking for a way to kind of account for the differences between those streets, those types of streets, but suffice it to say that there's differences. Parking, existing, we require 2 or 3 units for most middle housing types per, 2 or 3 off-street parking spaces per middle housing unit. The model ordinance responds to some state legislation around parking and prohibits requiring parking within a half mile of a major transit stop, which is essentially our bus rapid transit and light rail, so the SWIFT stations. And then a maximum of 1 space per unit on lots smaller than 6,000, and then maximum of 2 on lots greater than 6,000. The Objective Design Standards Toolkit, adds the idea of a maximum parking. And depending on which zone you pick, between a half and 1 for smaller lots and 1 for larger lots. And then it has a bicycle number of parking spaces as well. So the Objective Design Standards, fewer parking spaces than the model code, model ordinance, which has fewer parking spaces required than our current code. Staff were thinking to do 1 space per unit regardless of type, also including those reductions and exemptions for transit agency and affordable transit adjacency and affordable housing that we are either prescribed by state law or are in existing municipal code. So that would be within a half mile of of major transit stop. We have options on how we define that. With the accessory dwelling units, we used all-day transit, and there are a couple other parking related things at the state. That might be, yep, that's the last one, so we can talk about that for a minute.
Question on the second point there regarding the reductions and exemptions. There's a radius around frequent transit that's often discussed. I'm sure there's data out there to support it. I would love to better understand how many people actually walk to transit and what car ownership looks like for a density area like we're talking about. I just don't get the sense that car ownership is much different if you're within a half mile of transit than if you're, 3/4 of a mile or a mile of transit.
Sure. Yeah, I'm certain that there is some research out there along those lines, so we'll try to.
And it would be great if it was specific to climates like ours.
Sure, or worse. Hard to imagine on some days.
Additional questions? Commissioner Shelby?
Oh, I think this is, I think, in my view, this is something that the market can control for, and we shouldn't necessarily need to mandate parking, right? Like, if people want to buy homes that have parking, they'll buy homes with parking, or they'll rent homes with parking. This goes to lot coverage and percentages. It's a best use thing, and a parking stall is for most of the time, it's a terrible waste of space if you're trying to actually use it to house people.
I appreciate you channeling Commissioner Adkins, because I know he would want to get that in. So, Commissioners, additional questions or commentary on this subject? Okay, we have just one brief opportunity for public comment. Do we have anyone online? I don't have any sign-in sheets, so we have no one in-house online. Is anyone wishing to offer public comment?
Would caller with phone number ending in 0007 like to make a comment? No comments, I think?
Excellent. Okay, with that, then we are adjourned. Thank you.